Today again is another day, and I decided today to conclude on the last topic on cultism, cults, how they are formed, how to avoid them. But today I want to focus on another topic as part of that. What is worth fighting for? What is worth fighting for? Cults are formed because groups disagree on certain issues, and of course one side feels neglected and persecuted, and then it creates a cult, sometimes in the effort to wrest leadership from the hands of the other group, but sometimes just in the effort to survive. And so we have discovered that, and we've discovered what are the groups that really deserve to be called cults, and what are those that are not deserve to be called cults. Hence, we were able to define what cults really are. And so I would want to today focus instead on how we can avoid forming cults, especially those with a negative focus, by knowing what is worth fighting for. So when we know what is worth fighting for, we may avoid those issues that create some of, not only the creation of cults, but some of those negative things that we face in society, like crises, economic crises, social crises, even war. Cults, of course, sometimes are a result of radicalization, telling people that if they don't fight for this very thing, their lives will end, and so they must submit their lives to fight for a particular thing. And of course, these are seen as negatives and things that we should try to avoid. And it is true. And yet some of these cults, perceived cults, have good intentions. And that is why Christianity has survived centuries and centuries, because it came with good intentions. Judaism also has survived centuries and centuries. It came with good intentions. Many other systems have survived, even though they started as cults. Religions all over the world, cultural systems all over the world that have survived up to today, even though they started as cults. Like the Chinese system, we've mentioned, Islam itself has survived, and of course there is the struggle about radicalization up to today, but it has survived. So we have nations that are surviving, even though they are termed as pariah states. They are surviving because inside there is something that people agree with, and that gives them purpose, that gives them an identity and a future. So, of course, issues of nationalism come to the fore, issues of faith come to the fore, and just mere survival. These are the issues that are at stake. Now, the problem that we have is that some of the values, in quote, that tend to create cults are the same values that some people see as what government would ride on to maintain society. And for that reason, we find that some people believe that poverty helps to manage the people. They do not want to see certain people, more people elevated out of poverty, because they believe that if those people are poor, if more people are poor, they are more manageable. Some people also believe that less education helps them to manage the people. The less the people are educated, in their view, the more they are able to manage the people. Some also believe, of course, that religion, the popular one, is the opium of the masses. They believe that religion is a tool to keep the masses in control. And because of that, the tendency for cults to form is very, very rife, because of that function of religion. So religion becomes very important. That's why religion is one of the foremost channels through which cults are created, or even radicalization occurs. And so you see that these are the issues. So because of this, it is important for people to know what is worth fighting for. It is important for people, especially the youth, in every generation, to know what is worth fighting for. So, it is important for people to know what is worth fighting for, so that they will be able to avoid these bad leadership, the effects of bad leadership that tells them, okay, not to be educated. So they will be victims of suppression. Of course, tell them that poverty is a good thing. So they remain in that. And tomorrow they cry, I'm being suppressed. And also to over-depend on religious or religion to a point that it becomes a tool of suppression. So this is the issue. I'm going to be reading from a scripture in the Bible. And this is a very interesting scripture because it talks just about what I am talking about today. And it is in Matthew chapter 13, in verse 44. Matthew 13 verse 44, and it says this. Let me just read directly from the American Standard Version. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." A man discovers a treasure in a field, and because he's so happy that this treasure is that important, he needs to buy this field so that he will invest in this treasure. And so he goes and he sells everything he has to buy the field so that he can now harvest the treasure. This is something that we all can identify with. Most of our nations today thrive on one treasure or the other. Be it oil, of course, popularly oil in Nigeria. Be it gold, of course, gold is also found in Nigeria. Tin, columbite, coal. Most of what our nations thrive on are resources found in the land. And this is a scripture that really identifies with this. Taps from that as a source of inspiration. If you know the importance of something, you will be able to fight for that thing. And this is just the theme of what we are looking for at today. Some people are radicalized because they depend on certain things to survive. And when you say you're going to take away that thing from them, of course you radicalize them against yourself. They tend to create cults so that they can protect themselves. So this is the issue. And the key concept that will help us to settle within one another is understanding leadership. Understanding leadership. Leadership is a source of purpose. Leadership is a source of authority. And once leadership is linked to the right purpose, to the right authority, it will be able to chart a course, the correct course for the people to follow. But once there is a fault in the leadership, of course, there will be a problem. Groups will come and begin to radicalize the people against the leadership, and they will succeed. So this is the problem. And it is important for our leaders to know, because if they know this, they will be able to act right. And it is also important for them not to be ignorant of what is worth fighting for. It's not just knowing that, But they themselves must not be ignorant of what is worth fighting for. And that light, they will be able to chart the course, to be trailblazers, so that the generations that follow will be able to take up leadership. The problem that we have in many places in the world, it is a human problem. It is not just limited to one part of the world. But sometimes it is prominent in some parts of the world because of the youth, the relative youth of modern government in that place. Africa is a place where, of course, especially Nigeria, was kind of slow in developing the systems of government. And systems of government have moved from one stage to the other. And the most recent type of system of government was the feudalist system before the capitalist and the socialist systems came up. So the feudalist system depended on monarchs that owned the land. And when they owned the land, the land was a tool by which they governed the people, and they collected tax from the people to administer government, and of course the people got their own sustenance from their own lands, as small as they were. If they didn't have their own land, of course they benefited from government that fed them in exchange for labor. Now this is just the feudalist system as it was then. And at the time of colonization, of course, Africa, especially Nigeria, had not really gone far in the feudalist system. There were only a few kingdoms that had progressed to that level, like the Benin Kingdom, like the Danfodio Caliphate, the Borno Kingdom, of course the Kano Emirates were also part of that, and they developed through those various stages until that time. But most of the people in Nigeria were free peoples that governed independently in city-states and practiced trade freely, not really in the feudalist system. And you know the feudalist system is closely related to the socialist system. And so you find that those people, the Igbos in the East, were more into capitalism, you know. And of course, the tribes that were similar to them also practiced some form of capitalism, mixed with socialism, you know. And that is how they were. And so that is why we're having some of the problems we're having in Nigeria. Some people are used to the socialist system, others are used to the capitalist system. And so bringing them under Nigeria, you find that most of the conflicts were based on that. The Northern Protectorate functioned under a socialist system, while the Southern Protectorate accepted capitalism based on their own culture. Of course, more tilted towards capitalism. And although the Civil War was very political, some of that politics was surrounded around this way of thinking. Knowing this background, which is a very, very rich historical background, I cannot trace it in detail in this video, but when you read books, you will know how Nigeria developed. And it is not too different from how other nations of the world have developed, but knowing the details really helps. And to know why Nigeria is the way it is today. So many of the tribes were city-states, and so they were forced to practice some form of, they were more agrarian communities, but of course they needed to trade with others. And that freedom, because they didn't have any monarchs at their head, of course, it was more similar to the capitalist system, especially within the Igbo communities. And of course, the Yorubas also had access to the coastal areas and traded a lot. And so, of course, they had that. But because of Islam, the northern Nigeria was more towards socialism, which suited more of the feudal system, although they also engaged in a lot of trade. So you discover that that was the issue. And because of that, there was an invisible crack in ideology in the nation. And of course, That invisible crack was just by way of life. Most people like the socialist system, but the reality of what they practice was more of capitalism, especially the Igbos. And I'm sure that is what many people may disagree, but that is what contributed to factors that affected the Civil War. And of course, they are very close neighbors to the Yorubas. And the Yorubas, while being alluding a lot to education, also are more free, although they also imbibe the Islamic way of life, but they also like to engage in trade. And of course, trade is is the best profession in Islam. And so the Yorubas are more capitalist than socialist. So that affected some of the issues that have been plaguing Nigeria from inception up to today. And at the point, I want to quickly jump. I'm not drawing a historical. I'm not trying to go to make a historical survey. What interests me is how Nigerians have handled the issues that have come up from the time the post-Obasanjo period up to now. Of course, before Obasanjo, the military tried to sustain a mixed system. That is the truth of what people like Ibrahim Babangida, the former president of Nigeria, who ruled about 9 years, Yakubu Gowon himself too, who was one of the longest serving presidents of Nigeria. That is what they sustained, a mixed economy. While government maintained control of most of production, they also allowed private enterprises to exist and to subsist. And so this is what happened in Nigeria. So after Obasanjo, when Obasanjo came, because of the acceptance, and this is what many people do not know, because of the acceptance of democracy as a system of governance, democracy is more suited to the capitalist West. If you study the form of democracy that socialist countries practice, it is a more conservative form of democracy. And so when you accept the Western form of democracy, you tend to accept the more liberal form of economy, which is capitalism. And this is what Obasanjo, Nigeria accepted during the transition to democracy, which was led by Obasanjo. And so this is what happened. So after Obasanjo, now the problem came to the fore. Where do we go from here? And that is what happened when Goodluck was became president. He was advised to continue the process, continue to deregulate. And in deregulation, the removal of subsidy was on the forefront. And so we will see from here how that really affected Nigeria. Deregulation of the downstream sector of the petroleum. Nigeria, though endowed with a lot of resources, agriculturally, in terms of solid minerals, discovered oil during the Gowon administration. And from there, Nigeria became a very wealthy nation among its peers. Among the least developing countries, it became very wealthy. And this created a lot of things. This brought about corruption because Nigeria did not know how to handle these resources. And this brought about an over-dependence on oil itself. While agriculture was, as the former money earner for Nigeria, was abandoned, and of course solid minerals too was abandoned, we focused excessively on petroleum. And of course, at the point Nigeria was during the Obasanjo regime, it became necessary because of the mismanagement of those resources and the overdependence on oil. It became necessary for the government to now deregulate the downstream sector in terms of removing subsidy so that there can be competition in the market. And myself, at that time, I looked at it, and looking at what the Obasanjo regime had established, I took the side of the government, saying that yes, the government should be allowed to deregulate the market. But a group of our youth took the other side. Of course, in Nigeria, you have to understand Nigeria to understand what was really happening. During the Babangida regime, which was a very important period in Nigeria's life, Babangida himself was trying to introduce a more subtly introduced, while running a more socialist system, was subtly trying to introduce a little capitalism, encouraging Nigerians to open industries and small-scale enterprises by introducing the Social Adjustment Program, which is SAP. And during this period, of course, there were forces, especially among the workers, that resisted this change. And the reason was very important. The reason was that because of corruption, they were poorly paid. And because they were poorly paid, they could not afford to transport themselves to work. They could not afford certain things. If the subsidy on oil on petroleum products in the downstream sector was removed, it would affect workers. And so workers took a socialist position. Were forced to take a socialist position. And they fought Babangida on this and fought Abacha on this. And this is what led to the Obasanjo's period, where there was a tussle. Obasanjo had introduced some measures against the position of the workers, and those measures were the deregulation of all sectors, not just the petroleum sectors, but every government enterprises that were not working were deregulated. That means they were privatized, and so to introduce efficiency in the system. And this is what Obasanjo did. And the successes, some people may argue it was not really successful, but this created a more liberal business environment. And because of this, the Goodluck Jonathan administration was advised to continue with this deregulation. They were advised to continue with this deregulation. And so I took their side. Some of us took their sides. But some of the opposition leaders fought against it. And what that meant was that they were pushing for a more socialist economy, not a capitalist economy. And this was what happened. I will tell you what the problem is after this. Here lies the problem. Most of our youths did not know what they were fighting for. They just wanted to continue with the status quo. They didn't know they were fighting for one system against the other. Okay? Government should continue to subsidize. Government was subsidizing agriculture. Government was subsidizing education, although the education system was not working. The private sector had virtually taken over education. Government was subsidizing healthcare. Now, these three sectors are very important. Most countries in the world, in these three sectors, there is a subsidy. There is subsidy on healthcare. There is subsidy on education. There is subsidy on agriculture, even in the capitalist countries. But this is what the young people did not know. Instead of emphasizing that, they were emphasizing subsidy on petroleum. And that is the last sector that should be subsidized. Petroleum sector is a sector like, let's say, the forestry sector. If you say you want to subsidize logging, for instance, what will happen? Of course, you know you're going to lose your forest reserves. So they decided to back the subsidy of petroleum. They went out there and marched 10 million, organized a million march protest. and I think there was a talk of 10 million march protest. And I didn't take that side because Nigeria had already decided to deregulate. The government had already decided to deregulate all the sectors. And the most important sector to deregulate was petroleum, not health, not education, not agriculture. Remember that the educational sector had already been taken over by private, especially in the primary and secondary aspects. Only the university, the tertiary aspect was still in control of government, and of course the private sector was already coming in. So in those three sectors, there was subsidy already. So if you wanted to remove subsidy, it was petroleum, and so we backed it. But the youth leaders, following Labour, the path that Labour had taken, decided to continue with that. The problem we faced was that most youths did not know what they were fighting for. They did not know that it was two systems they were fighting that were in competition, the socialist and the capitalist system. And this was what created the problem. And that goes to our topic, what is worth fighting for? If you do not know what is worth fighting for, you will fail. And that is why we find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves today. The cost of living is so high. What happened at that point when government, it looked as if the youth were successful because government refused to remove subsidy, but they decided that a gradual increase in price was more sustainable. But the result of this was very, very funny. During the Goodluck Jonathan administration and successive administration, the Buhari administration, the regime of artificial pricing took over, inflation took over. And why? Subsidy on agriculture was gradually removed. For what reason? Nobody knew. Healthcare, there were people who were pushing violently for the removal of subsidy from healthcare, though they were not fully successful, but that was happening. Thirdly, of course, education already in the primary and secondary levels, private schools were had already taken over. So, of course, the tertiary level, the regulation began. The tussle between us, the academic staff union of universities, and the government began. Of course, school fees was being increased. So all these removals of subsidy were going on, and inflation was taking place, increasing in the price of agricultural products and all other products. And also, at the same time, the government was still increasing the price of PMS in the market, diesel and PMS. And so these created a multiplier effect in inflation and the cost of living, of course. So this is what happened. Because of this bad decision of our youth leaders and our labor leaders and our civil society leaders, this happened. If they had just read the signs and accepted the removal of subsidy on petroleum products in the downstream sector, probably they would have avoided this. But this is what happened. So this, in my view, emphasizes the need for us to know what we are fighting for, so that we will not be victim of those people who know more than we do and who now have the capacity to suppress us. So this is what is going on. And remember, in the midst of all this, the insurgency was taking place. So things, if you were a watcher of the economy or of politics, where would you watch? When all these things are happening, of course, you'll be interested in securing yourself. If there's no security, how can you watch the price of food? How can you watch what government is doing? Government needed to remove subsidy on some of these things to put it in security while subsidizing oil. So what could have happened? Even if they faced opposition, they had nothing else to do but to remove subsidy on those things, like we saw in the Buhari government. As Buhari was leaving office, he took a huge loan because he had to keep on subsidizing oil. And that is why Tinubu came in and removed the subsidy. And this is what we're facing up today. Because of our bad decision making, we cannot today dictate what the government does. This is what I want to emphasize for us today. It is so important. We must know what is worth fighting for. If we do not know what is worth fighting for, we will take the wrong side and we will destroy ourselves in the process. Now we have to look at two issues. I have kept on saying, during all these things, and in fact recently, when the End Bad Governance protest was taking place, I refused to join. Why? Because of this very issue. And the issue for me was very clear. We needed to go on the streets and ask for a referendum. A referendum to decide whether we will practice socialism or capitalism. Because there are a lot of forces on the streets that are uneducated and do not want our best, and so are involved in confusing the issues. They just tell us, go out there and take over power, but we do not know what it takes. If you do not know what it takes, you cannot go and take power. So we need to know what it takes first. And so we need to know the difference between socialism and capitalism. And for this video, I'll just be emphasizing what are the things that we must look at to make our choice. First of all, we need to know the strength and weakness of both. The strength of socialism is that government, if you have a good government, they are able to properly harness resources and equitably distribute to the people. But if you have a bad government, that will not take place. That is the disadvantage of socialism. Socialism only thrives in the absence of corruption. It only thrives in the absence of corruption. And this is one important factor we need to know. And so it is a very, very fragile system, opposed to capitalism. Capitalism has a lot of leeway in that there is a removal of the need for excessive regulation. And because of the removal of the need for excessive regulation, capitalism thrives on its own with very little regulation. It is referred to as a laissez-faire system, where it thrives on need, supply and demand. If I have a product and people need it, they will buy it. If people need something, they will go and look for that product. And this is how capitalism is. So capitalism removes the need for excessive regulation. And this is why it thrives. But socialism depends a lot on the absence of corruption, because there is a lot of regulation, depends a lot on the police, depends a lot on the courts, depends a lot on the government in administration at that point in time. So these are the things that we need to know about these things. So when we know this, by experience we will be able to decide, should I go for capitalism or should I go for socialism? In socialism, I will be hugely dependent on the government. In capitalism, I can decide what I want. But before I close this section, I want to emphasize one thing. Capitalism does not do well with necromancy. Necromancy only thrives in socialism. And this is only in a country that has been practicing this form of necromancy within socialism for hundreds and hundreds of years. Some people go to Dubai and they come back and say, oh, they're doing very well. That is one small country in the whole of the Middle East. Okay, and they've been practicing these things for very long. Okay, within Islamic context. So socialism does well if it has been practicing necromancy at that level for very long. But capitalism does not do well with necromancy, because necromancy is dependent on non-visual things, and capitalism, the world we live in, thrives on visual things. So when we know the difference between socialism and capitalism, we'll be able to go to the government with better informed with a request on the table. We want this form of government instead of that one. We want this one. But when we just go with one agenda, oh, we are hungry. Oh. So what do you want? You're telling the government they're not doing well. What should they do? You must have an idea of what they should do. Or remove the tax. But if you remove the tax, if we don't have money now, how are we going to run the government? So these are the things that we as youth leaders and opposition leaders, leadership is a secret to unpacking some of these things. And when you have good leaders, they are eager to share what they have with their followers because they believe what the Bible believes. And that is that the more the individual is empowered, educationally, intellectually, spiritually, the more he's able to serve himself, is able to serve the government in place. So knowing the difference between socialism and capitalism is very important. Knowing that socialism works with a system that has zero corruption. Once corruption is introduced, socialism will fail. And capitalism is a more liberal system that has very little regulation. And because there's very little regulation, is able to function even if there's a little corruption, is able to checkmate that corruption on its own because it operates on needs and wants. If I don't want your product, I don't buy it. If I want it, I buy it. So if you have a product that you're overpricing, people will stop buying it. And if the product is really worth that price, people will buy it. So capitalism is a system where much of the regulation has been removed, and the system is working very freely. And but socialism needs a lot of regulation. So a little corruption will destroy socialism. So that takes us to the aspect of education, the importance of education. Educating the people is very, very important. If you educate the people, you empower them. And it has been shown that the more educated the people are, they tend not to have so many children. And of course, they tend to prosper more. Now, we must know the difference. Some people, even in the capitalist system, still advocate more children. But you need to be able to distinguish between a system where one man has 20 children and 9 men have no children at all, people of the same age. You would guess that maybe that one man is a billionaire and the rest don't even have the money to pay dowry. So this is the problem. The education helps people to be able to say, okay, I can have only one child, I can have only 2 children. And a system where 10 people divide, maybe have 2 children, or one child, or 3 children, is better than one man having 10 and the rest not having any. So population is reduced when people are educated, hence the better sharing of resources. Also, more education means more equitable sharing, distribution of resources, because more people know what it takes. Like, for instance, the difference between capitalism and socialism, and what system works where better, in what situation. And so because more people are equipped with this knowledge, more of them are able to demand from government what they need to demand. And when it comes that they don't really need to demand anything, they don't. Like what we said about what is happening here in Nigeria. And the final one is that the tools of development are in the hands of the ordinary people, so that they can embark on development themselves. When there are more engineers, more doctors, more nurses, more sociologists, more economists, they have those tools of development in their own hands. They don't need to go to government all the time to ask for resources. And because of this good leadership, leaders are patient and they put resources into the lives of people rather than in themselves alone or into unnecessary infrastructure. And when they do this, they are planning for the long haul, and they avoid crises that come from ignorance, come from people just sitting down waiting for government to do everything for them. And they are not always just gullible to people who radicalize them, to people who tell them lies about the economy. And so there is more power in the hands of the people. I am David Tunji Chinke in Searching the Heart today.